Relapse, remission, and reclaiming your life. This is Wrestling with Recovery. Welcome to Wrestling with Recovery. I am your host, Zol, the podcast that takes a look at life in recovery and showing that recovery is, in fact, possible. As we do each and every episode, I want to start off by saying, first and foremost, one, thank you for tuning in. Two, this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal medical advice. We are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast. This podcast is not intended to replace professional medical or legal advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or management. If you or someone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts or crisis, please reach out immediately to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255 or text HOME, HOME, to the crisis text line at 741741. These services are free and confidential. This week, we are taking a look into relapse and talk about remission. Yes, I know that kind of edges a little bit more into that. Is addiction a disease or a choice territory? But we're going to discuss it anyways. And as far as the disease or choice side subject of things, there'll be a time and place for that. I think last week I said we were going to get into it, but as I was putting together the playlist on the YouTube side of things, which you can check out, Wrestling with Recovery, I realized that we hadn't talked about relapse or slips or lapses or you see why? I was like, wait a minute, we got to get to that before we can actually talk about addiction being a choice or a disease and all the other topics that come along with that. So putting the brakes on that for another week, because relapse is very much a part of the recovery journey. And it is a big problem for a lot of people out there. So we'll take a look at that a little bit later on. But as we do each and every week at this time, this portion of the podcast, we have the 3 count. And May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So this month on the 3 count, we are talking about 3 facts that pertain to mental health awareness. And when it comes to the 3 count, these facts are ones you may find obscure, you may find interesting, and you may find downright disturbing. So for the 3 count this week: 1, major disaster; 2, nonviolent; 3, treatment. And let's lead off with number 1 on the 3 count. Major disaster. Rates for mental health disorders double for those who are affected by a major disaster, which really isn't that surprising that it actually happens, but to see that the rates double after traumatic events or a major disaster, I also can't help but think, especially in the last 24 years, I mean, how many once in a lifetime natural man made disasters have we gone through as a society? So, if each one of those double and we've been experiencing them each time, then it's amazing to think about how much, by that theory, mental health disorders and diagnoses have risen as a result of that. So, even more reason why we need to be talking about mental health. Number 2, nonviolent. Okay. When people think about mental health, they have this stereotype that they draw. Think about that. Whenever you think of someone who has been diagnosed with a mental health disorder, what's the first thought? I'm even going to say it right now. This is going to be very controversial, but I'm going to say it anyways. Whenever there's a mass shooting in America, what's the first thing people go to? Oh, well, what's their mental health? What's their mental health like? Well, only 3 to 5% of violence acts can be attributed to people with serious mental health. disorders or mental health illness. 3 to 5% of violent acts. That's amazing. I'm not going to lie. I thought that number would be higher, but the fact that only 3 to 5% of violent acts can be attributed directly to mental illness says a lot about the stereotype that we have still to work through as a society, and conversations that still need to be had. And number 3 on the 3 count, wrapping it up this week, treatment. Non-medication treatments for mental health illnesses include yoga, meditation, and holistic approaches. So I know people, or at least for me, I'll speak to myself. Whenever I was diagnosed with depression, with anxiety, first place I thought to is, okay, cool. What kind of medication am I going to be on? I didn't ever think about how else to treat it. And in a lot of 12-step groups that I go to, that the idea of meditation is presented, there's such a blowback on it. It's amazing to see. Oh, I don't want to sit there for 15 minutes. Brr. And it's like meditation can actually be I've found for me to be one of the most therapeutic things I can do. Before I resented the silence, now I find comfort in the silence. And I think non-medication treatments are just as important as medical treatments to help with mental health illness. So if you are someone who is maybe researching the topic of, hey, do I have or how to care for someone with mental health, I think it's very important to look into non-medication treatment as well. And I think it's important to say here that through my journey and through my research, I've found that there is no one set cure all. I mean, it would be like thinking, okay, well, I broke my bone, I put a cast on it, now I'm healed. Well, no, now you got to go through the process. Okay, the casting is just but one step of the process of recovery in that sense. So when it comes to mental health illness and treating and recovering, or living with it, some mental illnesses always stay with you. Living with mental illness, to think that, okay, well, if I take this pill, it's going to fix it all. I think that's too simplistic of an approach to a complex problem. So I guess my challenge here to those listening is keep your mind open to there being more than one potential process, more than one treatment option, that is needed to help process mental health. So there you go. That is your 3 count for this week. So this week's topic here on the program is relapse and remission. Now, let's first start with the one that is widely known, and that's relapse. Relapse is very much a part of my journey. There are people that say relapse is not a part of sobriety. And as we talked about last week in last week's episode, sobriety beyond abstinence, that's correct, but only like a half truth, because the truth is sobriety is completely separate from abstinence. Now, if you were to sit here and say relapse is not a part of abstinence, then you would be correct. But whenever, with the way that we are defining sobriety here on this podcast, going above and beyond just simply abstaining, but instead sobriety includes the behaviors, the mindsets, the spiritual side of things. Now, relapse is a part of recovery. And that is something that I will say, because we'll talk about it here. I'm already getting ahead of myself. Need to reel it back in. So first, let's start off here with the definition of relapse as defined by the Oxford Dictionary. It is a verb meaning to suffer a deterioration after a period of improvement. Now, the noun version of the Oxford Dictionary is a deterioration in someone's state of health after a temporary improvement. What I found interesting And especially if you've been with us since day one of this podcast series. If not, pause it here, go back and listen to the other ones in the archives. But of all the definitions we've taken a look at, dissected, and really deep dived into, relapse is one that is pretty much straightforward. It is pretty well defined. And what I found interesting was, okay, that's the Oxford definition. What is the definition in this sense? What is, I tried to challenge it through treatment, through sobriety, through recovery, and yet it all came back to this one. So relapse is pretty straightforward. It's a straightforward definition for very complex people. So what about lapse or slips? Okay, now we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds here, because if you've heard someone say, "Well, I didn't relapse, I just slipped." Oh, I didn't relapse, I just had a lapse. Well, a slip is defined or identified as a very brief moment of drink or use, but stop quickly afterwards to avoid a full relapse. Now, sober.com identifies a slip as a moment, not limited to a single drink. So you could be in the moment and have one drink or multiple, and it still be a slip. What defines the slip or lapse is how soon does the behavior stop? How soon is it? Okay, no, uh, this is going down a slippery slope. This is returning to old ways. I am not going back to that. That is where a slip differentiates between a relapse. Now, while researching the definition and trying to really break down, okay, we know what a relapse is, but what is a slip? What is a lapse? I did not find any concrete medical supported or adopted definition of slip. I find that very interesting because, one, as we established so far throughout the series, again, go back to the archives, especially talking about the history of addiction, we are still very much in early research when it comes to how addiction works. So the fact that there isn't a medical definition of slip really doesn't surprise me all that much. Um, and it goes to show that there's still research to be done. And perhaps that's something that medically can be challenged before agreeing on. And I think it's also important to remember, whether you're in a journey or researching recovery in general, is that while there isn't a concrete definition for a slip, it has to be defined in some way. Okay, because even if you say, "Oh, I just keep slipping," "Oh, I just keep slipping," okay, what is it about it that you're defining it as a slip? Now you can challenge it. Which then, kind of maybe tweaks your mind the way you look at relapses and your recovery journey. So the question is now presented: if I slip, did I relapse? And the general consensus is no. And in the same way that I thought, okay, well, I'm going to find a concrete definition for a slip, there really isn't a set time frame of saying, okay, well, I continued this behavior. This is the cutoff date. If I don't stop my behavior by this, then I've relapsed. Because of slip being defined by sober.com as the particular moment, but stops immediately afterwards, that's the gray area. And that's why I think, too, it's important to remember everyone's journey is going to be different. Everyone's journey through recovery, you're going to hear similar points, similar moments, but it's not concrete saying, okay, if I do A, then I hit B, and if I do B, then I get to C. um, it's not that straightforward. It's going to be very much a roller coaster ride. Um, and so with that being said, about when does a slip become a full on relapse? That's why it's possible to have a recovery date longer than a sobriety date, or as I prefer to call it, abstinence date, as we established in last week's episode of Sobriety Beyond Abstinence. My recovery date differs greatly from my abstinence date. Now, that's where people do ask. And again, I tell them what I believe that they're allowed to know as far as my journey goes, because not everyone's privy to the details of my recovery. That's something that I hold near and dear to my heart, and I do take it very serious. Um, and if someone wants to sit there and argue with it, well, have fun with it. I'm just choosing not to play, you know? So that is why, though, and I think I've done a good enough job of establishing the difference between recovery, between sobriety, between abstinence, that as I move forward, it's easier to adopt recovery date, sobriety, abstinence date. Um, and more so, it is important that you find your family. Like, well, I know where my family is. My mom's here. My dad's there. No, your recovery family. Because everyone's journey is different. Just like everyone's political views are different, doesn't make them right or wrong for the most part. That's a whole different topic I am not going to get into. Their view is their view. And I choose to align with people that align with that. If the end goal is for us to recover, if the end goal is to abstain from a substance that was once abused, or a behavior that was negative on the lifestyle, then okay. But and it's important, because if you find yourself in a 12-step program or a harm reduction group, and the way that you believe recovery should work, or the way that works for you differs greatly, then I think it's important to say, okay, you know what? I appreciate what you guys do. Let's move on. Let's go find a different. I need to find another set. And also, it's important, again, why to keep your journey close to your heart, because I would be, I think, and then along with mental health illness, there are character defects such as people pleasing. I mean, how many of us in addiction are guilty of being, overworking ourselves to prove that we're worthy, or betraying who we are as individuals, so that way, hopefully, maybe that group over there might like us. That's why it's important to find, okay, in recovery, these are my people. This is my family. This is my recovery family. I remember in rehab, um, John, one of the counselors, shout out John, he had mentioned that recovery requires a recovery family, similar to that you have, your family for family problems, you have your coworkers for for work problems, you have your sports fans for sports problems, things like that. So recovery journey is no different. Can you do it alone? It's probably possible, but probably very difficult. Why make it any more difficult than it already is? I think it's also important to establish here that just because you relapse does not mean you failed. I love the quote from Batman Begins back in early 2000s. When was that? 2005, I believe. And the quote is, "Why do we fall? So we can learn to pick ourselves back up." Now, I'm more than comfortable in sharing my recovery journey. Obviously, I'm doing this podcast, but my journey does have a lot of relapses. And I'm going to be perfectly honest here. The truth is, there for the longest time, I didn't want to give up drinking. I mean, yeah, I'd go to 12-step programs. Yeah, I did counseling. Oh yeah, I'm never going to touch a drink again. Oh, but I'm not going to drink like that. I mean, I'm still gonna drink. I'm not gonna drink that. Okay, okay. I'm not gonna drink that, but I'm gonna try that. The truth is, I didn't want to give up drinking. The truth is, I was afraid of what life without alcohol was like because it was comforting. It made me feel comfortable. There was a lot of events that I've gone through, some self-inflicted and some that's just, it's life. And I remember there came a point well before my recovery date that I knew that it was bad for me. There was nothing good that was coming of it. I put myself in more danger um, than what needed to be. And even as I was recovering, okay, well, day 4, day 5 of abstinence was really the biggest struggle for me because I'd get to those and I'm like, oh, okay, well, I feel better. I would talk myself into it. A professional wrestler, um, and family legend in pro wrestling, Jeff Jarrett, in his podcast, My World, which I cannot recommend enough because he's very honest and open about his journey into recovery. He said, as an addict, as someone in recovery, I can rationalize, justify, minimize anything. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, wow, that is so true. I can rationalize any drink, I can justify any drink, and I can minimize any drink. And once I heard that, and that was about 4 years ago, I started making some progress, but I kept slipping, I kept relapsing. And it wasn't until here recently that I finally realized, this relapsing stuff has got to stop, and got a lot more serious about it. So relapse, and that's why I do take to heart whenever someone says in groups and in presenting and says, oh, well, relapse isn't part of recovery. Well, that's bullshit. It very much is a part of recovery. Now, relapsing isn't part of abstinence. If you want to argue about whether it's a part of sobriety, okay, let's sit down and let's compare notes. But to sit there and tell someone that is trying to get their act together that relapsing isn't a part of recovery, that's just straight out dangerous. Because recovery is a journey and it is unique. Now, if there was a blueprint that says, if you do this, then that, but you have to avoid relapsing. Well, now, as we discussed last week, restraining ourselves from indulging into something that gives us comfort, a little bit more difficult. So, relapse, as you can tell, it is a pain point for me because just because you relapse does not make you any less worthy of recovery. I applaud those that have said, hey, you know what? I'm done drinking. Not for me. And they put that last drink down and they've never touched it since. Just as much as I am in awe of the individual who says, you know what? I know I need to quit drinking. I keep relapsing, but I'm not giving up. Because that takes strength too. Just as much as putting down the last drink. And I mentioned this right out of the get-go, but having that sort of compassion is what's missing in our world. So let's talk about remission. We got about 6 minutes left here in the program. Let's talk about remission. Last week, by the time this hits, so earlier this week as I'm recording, I hit a huge milestone in my recovery. I am over 90 days of continued abstinence from alcohol. I am on my way to sobriety. There's still some things that I do that I'm like, okay, that's not quite sober yet. I'm still relying on those cookies over there. What up? And I'm on my way to sobriety. But as far as abstinence go, I hit 90 days. This is actually the second longest stretch of sustained sobriety in my life since turning of age. I'm excited for it. I still got a ways to go, but this is a huge hurdle. Now, I didn't medically, I was diagnosed as having a substance use disorder. I was like, okay, well, what's a substance use disorder? Like, the National Institute of Mental Health defines substance use disorder as a treatable mental disorder that affects a person's brain and behavior, leading to their inability to control their use of substances like legal or illegal drugs, alcohol, or medication symptoms. It can be moderate to severe, with addiction being the most severe form of SUD. Now, we will discuss SUD in a later episode. As you can tell, we are running dangerously close to out of time. But I didn't realize this. Okay, so we've heard of substance abuse disorder, substance use disorder, things like that. This is something that I learned this week that I wanted to make sure to share as we were talking about relapsing. Remission, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5, remission for SUD has 3 stages. The first one being initial, up to 3 months. So let's say someone's like, okay, that's it, I'm done. Okay, so within the first 3 months of abstaining, that's initial remission. Then once you hit the 90-day mark to a year, so in this case for me, I am in early remission from substance use disorder. I was like, oh, that's a thing. Yeah. Now, here's where maybe a little bit more motivation to hit to that point. Sustained remission from substance use disorder is in a timeline of 1 to 5 years, and stable remission is greater than 5 years. I learned something, and so that's why I wanted to share it with you. So when we get to that point, the point of going into recovery, and we're facing the struggle, the urges, the cravings, the romanticizing of the drink, it truly is 2 options: either relapse or remission. That's it. Once you're into recovery, you're either going to relapse or you're going to remiss. And honestly, not too sure how much more simple it can get than that. I sat here and I thought, well, wow, if I knew that sooner, would I? Possibly. But being the spiritual being that I am now, still, as you can tell, still struggle with it a little bit, but definitely a lot more easing into it than before. Things unfold exactly as they're supposed to. I don't know why things happen the way that they do, or what, but all I know is that right here, right now, as I'm recording, right here, right now, as you're listening, whether it is 3 days after I get done recording or 3 years from when this is recorded, things happen exactly as they should. And to sit here and say, well, if I would have known that sooner, if I would have, okay, that's fine and great, but you know that now. And what are you going to do with it now? That's what we can do moving forward. So we got about 2 minutes left here in the program. Wow. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Not quite sure yet what next week's topic is, but I do know we are close to hearing another story. Gonna reach out to a couple of individuals, see if we can't knock out a couple of recovery stories to share here on the program. But it is time for What Are You? Okay, the part of the program where where I share what I am listening to, what I am reading, or maybe what I'm watching. And I am a huge nerd. If you haven't figured it out by the stuff in the background, I am a huge nerd. And I am watching X-Men 97. No spoilers, but it is one of the best superhero adaptations I have watched in a long time. If you're like me, who grew up with the Saturday morning X-Men cartoons back in the 90s, or even if you loosely watched it, you don't really have to go back and watch a whole lot of the old cartoon to understand what's going on now, but it is so good. I think one of the things I didn't think was possible was to cry as much as I have watching a cartoon series, but being in recovery and not numbing, it's amazing what you start to feel. So can't recommend it enough. There are some topics that even pertain to recovery that I think could be used in that sense. So that is what I'm watching. Hey, give me a follow on socials at Wrestling with Recovery Pod, or on Twitter, WW Recovery Pod. Let me know, what are you watching? What are you reading? What should I be reading or watching other than my P's and Q's? Thank you, everyone, for tuning in this week. Until next time, bye.